passages also include instructions for how to sacrifice animals, something we no longer practice. They allow for polygamy and the keeping of concubines. They say that slavery is okay, and they offer prohibitions against such things as eating meat and dairy products in the same meal. Again, practices we no longer adhere to. Yet, we tend to pick out the part about homosexual practices as the ones that are still pertinent today. We kind of push the others aside. In other words, we pick and choose which ones we want to discard and which ones we want to uphold. I don't think that's right. Turning to the New Testament, there are only 3, some would argue 4 passages that even mention homosexuality. And all of those are in the epistles, the writings of Paul and some of the other followers of Jesus. Nowhere in the 4 Gospels or the teachings of Jesus is homosexuality mentioned. Maybe it wasn't a big deal to him. The first of those passages, 1 Corinthians 6, 6-10. And I want to read these passages to you because I want to be honest and upfront and let you hear what they say, because there are diverse interpretations of what they mean. And you need to know both so that you can make for yourself an informed decision. 1 Corinthians 6, 6-10. But instead, does a brother or sister have a lawsuit against another brother or sister? And do they do this in front of unbelievers? The fact that you have lawsuits against each other means that you've already lost your case. Why not be wrong instead? Why not be cheated? But instead you are doing wrong and cheating. And you're doing it to your own brothers and sisters. So basically, Paul's saying, you're not supposed to sue, but we do it every day. He continues, don't you know that people who are unjust won't inherit God's kingdom? Don't be deceived. Those who are sexually immoral, that covers a whole host of sins, does it not? Those who worship false gods, adulterers, both participants in same-sex intercourse, thieves, the greedy, drunks, abusive people, and swindlers won't inherit God's kingdom. Did you hear the whole list of things included? Lawsuits, adultery, greed, drunkenness. And scholars suggest that what is referred to as same-sex intercourse was not what might take place between consenting adults in a committed relationship, but instead male prostitution as an act of worship to a pagan god. Changes the meaning a little bit, doesn't it? Besides, they were bound by their culture. People in that time had no concept of homosexuality as an orientation, as a way people are born. And so we're not talking about what we're referring to when we say homosexuality today. In 1 Timothy 1, 8-10 contains similar lists. Now we know that the law is good if used appropriately. We understand this. The law isn't established for a righteous person, but for people who live without laws and without obeying any authority. They are the ungodly and the sinners. They are people who are not spiritual and for whom nothing is sacred. They kill their fathers and mothers, murder others. They are people who are sexually unfaithful and people who have intercourse with the same sex. They are kidnappers, liars, individuals who give false testimonies in court, and those who do anything else that is opposed to salvation. Hear this again. They are the ungodly and the sinners. They are people who are not spiritual and nothing is sacred to them. Timothy is talking about people who don't have a faith. People who don't believe in God as revealed through Jesus the Christ. Persons for whom nothing is sacred. They're not committed Christians like those who are part of our journey of faith. Those whose orientation is different from the majority, but whose faith is just as strong, perhaps stronger than some of ours. Just as an aside, 1 Timothy later goes on to prohibit divorce, something we've come to accept in our society. And I love this one. Timothy also says women should not preach. But again, we pick and choose, do we not? We pick the ones we like and set aside the ones we don't. Do you see what I'm getting at? When you read these passages, as few as they are, you've got to read them in light of the culture in which they were written, but also in the bigger picture of who God is as portrayed in the scriptures of the Old and New Testament. I think if you do so, you come away with a different understanding. Maybe, maybe not, and if you don't, that's okay. We don't all have to agree. Then there is Romans 1:20-31. This is perhaps the most problematic of all 5 of those passages. Ever since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, God's eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen because they are understood through the things God has made. So humans are without excuse. Although they knew God, they didn't honor God as God or thank Him. Instead, their reasoning became pointless and their foolish hearts were darkened. And while they were claiming to be wise, they made fools of themselves. They exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images that looked like mortal humans, birds, animals, and reptiles. So God abandoned them to their heart's desires, which led to the moral corruption of degrading their own bodies with each other. Heterosexual and homosexual. They traded God's truth for a lie, and they worshiped and served the creation instead of the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. That's why God abandoned them to degrading males. The females traded natural sexual relations for unnatural sexual relations. Also in the same way, the males traded natural sexual relations with females and burned with lust for each other. Not were attracted to. Burned with lust. Males performed shameful acts with males, and they were paid back with the penalty they deserved for their mistake in their own bodies. Since they didn't think it was worthwhile to acknowledge God, God abandoned them to a defective mind to do inappropriate things. They were filled with all injustice, wicked behavior, greed, and evil behavior. They were full of jealousy. Have you ever been jealous? Murder, fighting, deception, malice. They were rude and proud. I've never been that way. And they brag. They invent ways to be evil, and they are disobedient to their parents. They were without understanding, disloyal, without affection, and without mercy. Again, did you hear everything that's included here? That's considered to be sinful? There's no ranking. There's no one is worse than the other. Greed, injustice, slander, gossip, jealousy, malice. Acts I suspect most of us have been guilty of, at least some of that list, at one time or another. So also, as with the early passages, many scholars believe that Paul was talking here not about homosexual orientation as we understand it today, but heterosexuals who pursued homosexual acts or sexual acts conducted in the worship of pagan gods. It was disloyalty to God that was an issue. It was being something other than who God created you to be. If you were a heterosexual male and you did degrading things to other males in the service of a pagan god, that was the issue here. At least that's what many commentaries suggest. Again, though, there are other Christians who would interpret these passages more literally, to be fair. And I think we can all agree that there is much disagreement in the Christian community as to what these passages are talking about and just what they mean. That's why I wanted to kind of lay it out for you. I want you to hear that we don't all agree. just as we don't all agree about whether or not women should be in the pulpit. For progressive, this issue is about justice and the love of God as revealed in Jesus, not just about a few passages, very few passages written by his followers who maybe didn't always get it. Inspired, yes, but human also. Bound by a culture and a time and understandings as they existed in that day. So wherever you fall on this issue, whatever your beliefs about this, I think it's pretty clear that this was not a pressing concern in the early church. And that Jesus was much more concerned about our loving God and neighbor, about how we treat one another, about how we care for the most vulnerable among us, about hypocrisy, and as Justin talked about, our tendency to judge, and about how we use the resources God has entrusted to our care. Are we greedy and keep them to ourselves, or do we use them for the betterment of others? Those were the things Jesus talked about again and again and again. He never talked about homosexuality. Furthermore, over and over again, Jesus challenged the system and religious leaders who were more concerned about rules and legalities than they were about people. Yet it seems to me that when it comes to homosexuality, more Christians today act or more closely resemble the Pharisees than they do Jesus. And like I said earlier, they tend to major in the minors. And I can't help but wonder what Jesus thinks about that. So, as briefly as I could do it, and as comprehensively as I could do it in one sermon, that's what the Bible does and doesn't say about homosexuality. Again, I wanted to lay it out in as honest and complete a fashion as I could, so that you can come to your own conclusion. That's between you and God. Now, for just a moment, I'd like to look at what the United Methodist Church maintains, and in particular, the actions and decisions of our recently completed General Conference. As I think I said earlier, our stance on this issue hasn't changed much over the last 40 years. That, in spite of new information, not just from biblical scholars, but from the realm of medicine and the social sciences, about homosexuality not being a choice, but an orientation, the way people are born. A way 5 to 10% of our population is born. And even those times when it is a choice, it is often the result of traumatic life experiences, traumatic childhood experiences at the hands of persons of the opposite sex that make it hard for a person to trust a member of the opposite sex. Yet with the vast growth of the United Methodist Church in Africa and other third world countries, our position has in some ways become less tolerant in the church as a whole, the Christian church. Yet, in the United States, the opposite of that is true. Approximately 40% of this year's General Conference, the delegates to this year's General Conference, were from Africa and other developing nations outside the U.S. And I think this was more clearly seen, reflected in the votes on issues of sexuality. The votes generally, for the most part, tended to be 55% for maintaining the current position and 45% in favor of changing the language so that it no longer includes the phrase that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. Now, if my math is right, it's been a long time since I've done much math, but if my math is right, and most of the votes, and assuming that most of the votes for maintaining the current position were from delegates from outside the U.S., and I think that's a fair assumption, that means that about 80% of the United States delegation was in favor of doing away with that language. I don't know why it's the case that those in other lands see it so differently. Maybe it's because they're newer Christians and have a more fundamental understanding of Scripture. Maybe they don't have access to the latest and best of biblical scholarship. And sometimes I think they just come from more primitive cultures where homosexuals are still stoned, but polygamy is still widely accepted. Whatever the reason, we are a deeply divided church. And we have strayed far from our Methodist roots, where disagreements were not seen as a bad thing and where differences in interpretation were welcome. One of my favorite Wesley quotes, I have it in a frame in my office. If your hand is with mine, if your heart is with my heart, in love and loyalty to Jesus Christ, you give me your hand. Wesley was a tolerant man. He did not believe that everyone had to believe exactly the same way he did. It was your commitment to Christ that made you a brother or sister in the faith, not your particular interpretation of Scripture. You know, last month I watched much of the deliberations of General Conference via live streaming on the computer. And I think one of the saddest and most telling moments of just how far we've strayed from our Methodist roots came when there was a debate on the floor of General Conference about whether all people deserve the love of God. Folks, that's not Methodist as I learned it. Seriously? We debated whether or not God's love was for everyone? And I have to say, all of the speeches against that, or all the speeches that said God's love wasn't for everyone, came from the African delegations. Fortunately, good sense prevailed, and that was defeated. And we once again affirmed what Wesley and Methodists have always believed, that God's grace is available to everyone. But it wasn't by a large margin. I'm sorry, I was very bothered by this. Sorry. Another heartbreaking moment for me had to do when the majority of delegates refused to even acknowledge that we are divided on this issue and that we do hold widely divergent beliefs. Again, that's not who we have traditionally been as United Methodists. Two of our leading pastors, Adam Hamilton, Church of the Resurrection, the largest United Methodist church in the United States, they worship over 6,000 a weekend. And Mike Slaughter of Ginsburg, another of our leading pastors, neither of them really theologically liberal, moderates by anyone's definition, proposed an amendment that would acknowledge at least that we disagree. I want to read that to you, and just bear with me. It's a little long, but I think it's important that you hear this. Homosexuality continues to divide our society and the church. All in the United Methodist Church affirm that homosexual persons are people of sacred worth, and all are welcome in our churches. But we disagree as a people regarding whether homosexual practice is contrary to the will of God. The Bible is our primary text for discerning God's will. We read it and interpret it by the light of the Spirit's witness, with the help of the thoughtful reflections of Christians throughout the centuries, and assisted by our understanding of history, culture, and science. The majority view through the history of the church is that the Scriptures teach that same-sex sexual intimacy is contrary to the will of God. This view is rooted in several passages from both the Old and New Testament. A significant minority of our church views the scriptures that speak to same-sex intimacy as reflecting the understanding, values, historical circumstances, and sexual ethics of the period in which the scriptures were written, and therefore believe these passages do not reflect the timeless will of God. They read the scriptures related to same-sex intimacy in the same way they read the Bible's passages on polygamy, concubinage, slavery, and the role of women in the church. United Methodists will continue to struggle with this issue in the years ahead as a growing number of young adults identify today with what is the minority view. The majority view of the General Conference, and thus the official position of the church, continues to hold out that same-sex intimacy is not God's will. We recognize, however, that many faithful United Methodists disagree with this view. It is likely that this issue will continue to be a source of conflict within the church. We have a choice. We can divide, or we can commit to disagree with compassion, grace, and love, while continuing to seek to understand the concerns of the other. Given these options, schism or respectful coexistence, we choose the latter. We commit to disagree with respect and love. We commit to love all persons, and above all, we pledge to seek God's will. With regard to homosexuality, as with so many other issues, United Methodists adopt the attitude of John Wesley, who once said, "Though we cannot think alike, may we not love alike. May we not be of one heart, though we are. May we not be of one heart, though we are not of one opinion." Without all doubt, he said, we may. Respectfully submitted, Adam Hamilton, Mike Slaughter. As I watched the vote on this amendment taking place, I had a sick feeling in my stomach. I knew you would be defeated. And I have to tell you when it was. I cried. Sorry. I love the Methodist Church. I've given my life to it. And when I see us act this way, it hurts me. I was heartbroken as I thought of the faithful, committed disciples in our church who happened to be gay. And I hurt because of the harm, the wounds that our church has and will continue to inflict on those in the minority. This is not the Methodist Church I grew to love as a young adult. This is not the one into which I was ordained. It leaves me profoundly sad. I think this is in part true because of the wonderful growth we have experienced in other parts of the world. That's a good thing. That we are making Christians in predominantly what had once been non-Christian nations. Unfortunately, that growth has been a mixed bag. We're no longer a Wesleyan church, at least not in places outside the U.S. But there is a ray of hope. There is now much talk in the United States church about moving from a global church to a regional church, meaning that we will have central conferences. Conferences over here, the United States would be a conference all its own, and that we would not all have to agree on this and other issues. If this happens, our position will change. If it doesn't, it may well signal the continued demise and the death of the Methodist Church in the U.S. and probably worldwide, because the United States Church puts 90% of the bill through our apportionments. So while I am profoundly sad about the position of the global church, I am encouraged by the growing number of reconciling congregations churches in the U.S. like Journey of Faith. And I'm very thankful for you. If you're interested in being more a part of this, tonight at Trinity, some of you read the article in the Statesman this morning. Tonight at Trinity United Methodist Church, a church who's been reconciling for 20 years, they're having a celebration of all kinds of unions. I'm going to go. I want to be a part of that as a statement of protest against our current position. Also here, as a reconciling church, we're part of what's called Reconciling Ministries Network. There's some stickers that have their website. And it's interesting, it says on here, if your heart is with my heart, take my hand. John Wesley. I apologize that this sermon was longer than usual. I didn't feel I could do it justice in less time. I'm sorry I get emotional. This is an emotional issue for me. I love my church. But I'm not very happy about where it stands right now. Again, thank you for being the kind of congregation that you are, for the witness you provide in the United Methodist Church and in this community. I am blessed beyond belief to be your pastor. And I am proud to be your pastor. Thanks be to God. I call to discipleship as the time is now, as we stand and sing together. If there are those here who